This morning we're going to be looking at a topic that may seem a little more targeted, and that's because it is, and that's going to be, let there be light. It's going to be targeted a little bit more for those who are older. However, that doesn't mean that there's not lessons, and we will cover some lessons that are for the younger also. But in the verses that were read for us, this is, as Trey said, the lesser known of the giants that David faced. We all remember David facing Goliath and the great victory that was there and the great courage and bravery that young lad showed in facing that giant. However, here David's at the end of his life. He's grown older. He grows weary, and he's almost defeated in battle. And because of that, the men of Israel say, it's time for you to give up the keys to the car. In our society, I think that's kind of what it's like, is that you can no longer do the things that you used to do. And there's some things that you're not to do anymore. But here they say it's because you may put out the lamp of Israel. You may quench that lamp, that guiding light that we've had that's way too valuable. And because of that, you need to assume a different role. And so we're going to be looking at that this morning, and I hope that that's going to be encouraging to you. It's not meant to be a downer. It's not meant to be one of those things where you make yourself a recluse and decide that you're no longer valuable at all. But instead, I want this to be an encouragement to our older people in the audience. I hope when I get older that it's something I can look forward to. Don't laugh at that. Because as we go through some of the verses this morning, I think there's things that we're probably all going to be able to relate to. Okay, so if you're ready for your 3 words, let's see the notebooks hold up high this morning. All right, very good. Here's your 3 words. The words are going to be honor, wisdom, and guides. When we think about older people, we're going to notice a few verses this morning that talk about the kind of honor and respect that's supposed to be extended toward those who are older, especially those who are older and are faithful to God. We're going to notice some verses about that. One of the reasons why is because with older age should come wisdom. And I appreciate the fact that the adult class has been talking about wisdom. We're going to talk a little bit about it this morning. Maybe a little bit different perspective on wisdom as well. And they're to be guides. As older people, sometimes they will tend to withdraw. They'll retire even from spiritual service, and that's not to be the case. Instead, it should be that as you become older, it'd be actually more valuable if you were more visible, because you are to be guides to those who are younger and those generations that are to follow. And these are some lessons I think we can gain from these verses. As we said a moment ago, the days of David's glory have passed. He's grown older. And we can remember way back in 1 Samuel 17 when he's facing Goliath and how it was that when he went out to that battle, he was amazed that all of Israel were not willing to go out and do battle with this giant who dared to defy the armies of God. Even the king of Israel, Saul, was not willing to go out, but David said that he would go out. But when you look at 1 Samuel chapter 17, if you'll turn there with me to notice just a few verses from that chapter. If you're using one of the Pew Bibles, this will be page 263. Page 263 in the Pew Bible if you're using that. But 1 Samuel 17, notice a few things that it said about David as he's going out to battle against this giant Goliath. 1 Samuel chapter 17, and let's skip down to verse 40. It says, so then he took up his staff in his hand, and he chose for himself 5 smooth stones from the brook. Some suggest that the reason that David took these 5 stones was because of these brothers of Goliath that we seem to be talking about in 2 Samuel 21. We're going to notice some other giants are mentioned in that chapter as well. But he takes these 5 smooth stones from the brook, and he put them in a shepherd's bag, in a pouch which he had, and the sling was in his hand, and he drew near the Philistine. Philistine came and began drawing near to David, and the man who bore the shield went before him. But when the Philistine looked about and saw David, he disdained him. And this is why. When he looked at David at this stage of David's life, this is how David looked. He was only a youth, ruddy and good looking. So the Philistine said to David, am I a dog that you come to me with sticks? And the Philistines cursed David by his gods. And the Philistine said to David, come to me, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the air and the beasts of the field. Then David said to the Philistine, you come to me with a sword, with a spear, and with a javelin. But I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you and take your head from you. And this day I will give the carcasses of the camp of the Philistines to the birds of the air and the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel. Then all this assembly shall know the Lord does not save with sword or spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hands. So it was when the Philistine arose and came near and drew near to meet David. Notice this, that David ran. David hurried and ran toward the army to meet the Philistine. Then David put his hand in his bag and took out a stone, and he slung it and struck the Philistine in his forehead. So the stone sank into his forehead, and he fell on his face to the earth. And David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone, and struck the Philistine and killed him. But there was no sword in the hand of David. It's a much different image than what you have in 2 Samuel 21. Now David has grown older. And if you back up in 2 Samuel chapter 18, the first 3 or 4 verses, we see that the request for David to no longer go out to battle has already been made once. He's much more valuable to them if he were to stay home than to be out there on the battlefield. And in 2 Samuel 21, even though David still has the same bravery, the spirit is still there, but the flesh is weak. He still is out there in battle, and maybe the reason for that is because he learned the lesson back with Bathsheba, that when the armies are out there fighting, he's supposed to be out there with them. And maybe he's learned that lesson is why he's out there with them again. But we see that David is now facing this other giant who has this 300 shekels of a spear. If you remember, Goliath's spear is 600 shekels. This is half the size. Instead of being 16 pounds like Goliath's, it's 8 pounds. David is literally now about to be defeated by a man that is half the man that Goliath was. And he's about to be killed. But Abishai, his nephew, by the way, comes to his defense and rescues him. And the people say to David, "You can no longer do this. This is not the place for you, because you are a lamp to Israel, and we cannot afford to lose you. You can't do this anymore." There was an older lady that we had in Alabama that as she was growing older, she started to lose a few of her faculties. And the children kept trying to take the keys away from her because they said it's too dangerous for you to be driving. So they kept wanting to take the keys away from her because they were afraid she'd hurt herself or maybe even hurt someone else. But they were confounded by the fact that she still managed to drive around no matter how many times they took the keys away from her, because she knew the day was coming, and she created like a bag full of keys for her car and hid them all over the house. Well, one morning, the police called her family, and they said that she was circling the parking lot next to the church building at like 1:30 in the morning. She got confused, thought it was time for services, and she was there, and she could not figure out how to get out of the parking lot. She couldn't figure out how to stop the car, and they finally said, "We've got to do something." So what they ended up doing was taking the battery out of her car and saying, "Well, it's not running, so it's not going to help you out." But that was a sad occasion. It was sad for the family. It was sad for her. But it was one of those things that we understand that is needed. That when you think about the things that the older people face, they are like giants that older people face. If we go to Ecclesiastes chapter 12, verses 1 through 6, this is page 603 in the Pew Bible if you're using one of those. But Ecclesiastes 12 is getting to the conclusion of the whole matter about what a person's life is actually about. And the first thing that it talks about in that chapter is addressed to the young people. And it says, "Remember now," this is Ecclesiastes 12, starting at verse 1, "Remember now your Creator in the days of your youth." He says, "Before the difficult days come, and the years draw near when you say, 'I have no pleasure in them.'" In these next few verses, notice how many of a person's faculties, physical, mental, all these different things that they have to go through as they get older, that young people don't face yet, but need to be prepared for. While the sun and the light and the moon and the stars are not darkened, and the clouds do not return after the rain. It doesn't seem to be one storm after another for you when you're young. When you're older, sometimes it does feel that way. In the day when the keepers of the house tremble and the strong men bow down, maybe talking about the arms and the legs there. And when the grinders cease because they are few, obviously talking about the teeth. And those that look through the windows grow dim, the eyes. The doors are shut in the street, and the sound of grinding is low, the ears. When one rises up at the sound of a bird, how many times do you get up at night? And when you get older, do you find yourself getting up a lot earlier? Here, at the sound of a bird, you're rising. And all the daughters of the music are brought low. Also, they are afraid of height. and of terrors of the way. How many times do we say to older people, don't climb up on that, get off that ladder? And we're afraid for them because of how brittle they may be. When the almond tree blossoms, some people say that may be reference to hair. I haven't had almonds in my tree for a while. The grasshopper is a burden, and the desire falls, and a man goes to his eternal home, and the mourners go about the streets. Remember your Creator before the silver cord is loosed and the golden bowl is broken or the pitcher shattered at the fountain. He does not present a very good idea, even when he concludes with the wheel broken at the well and the dust returning to the earth and so forth. He doesn't present a very appealing viewpoint of what later life is going to be like. And a lot of older people do face these things. We know that there are inevitable changes. Physically, our bodies are going to change. David was no longer that ruddy, good-looking youth that he once was. David had been beat up by life. Much like you think about Paul with all the persecution and trials that he went through and how he may have appeared to people because of all of that. Well, with our bodies, it's going to change. We're going to naturally lose some of our mental faculties that we once had. That's an inevitable change that's going to happen. It's going to be inevitable that we are going to be one of the few remaining, maybe, of our siblings in our households. Or maybe amongst our friends, we may be some of those last few. And for that reason, sometimes these are times of very solemn reflection where you're constantly going to the hospital to see someone that you knew or know, that you're constantly going to the funerals of those that you knew. My dad was at a funeral one time with this man that had been a friend with his for a lot of years, and they had been going to a lot of funerals during that time of people they had grown up with and knew. And the man said to my dad, I am tired of going to funerals. And my dad told him he needed to get his life right because the next one may be his. And it wasn't long after that man and his son were killed in a car wreck. There are inevitable changes, and it does cause us to have some very solemn reflections about what that means. When you're looking at the obituaries and you start seeing people that you know, that you grew up with, it really does start you to thinking about your own life. You start feeling like you're a stranger for real in this world. You can't relate to the things that people are doing and going through and the way in which people are thinking and the way things are changing because they're so different than the way in which you grew up. I mean, most of us would have to admit that even when it comes to our wardrobe, maybe we got up to about 1997 and said, okay, that's as far as I'm going. And it may be that way with music and movies and everything else. But we start feeling like strangers in the world that we're living in. It causes us to reflect. You can sometimes feel like you're abandoned, even by your own family, that you're useless, that you're no longer wanted, you're no longer needed. And maybe David started feeling some of these things or would have felt these things when his men finally said to him, they had already told him once, and now they're telling him again, you are not going out to battle with us anymore. This is not going to happen anymore. You're not coming back out here. How hard would it have been for David to hear those words? And what do you think it was like for those soldiers, those men who may have been gathered around the campfire talking about this and this conversation that needed to be had with David about this situation and deciding who's going to say this to him and how are we going to say it to him? That would have been a very difficult circumstance to go through. Many times people feel that they are abandoned, and really it's just about becoming tired. That life has a way of every time there's one rain that passes, here comes the clouds again. And another storm is on the horizon. And it can just wear you down. David was weary. And David was almost defeated. It can, in very real terms, feel like another giant that we are facing. In another situation where we can feel like we are overwhelmed. And where is God? Psalm 71, verse 9. For the older people, Psalm 71 would be a very good one for you to study. The whole psalm is about growing older and facing old age and the circumstances around it. Verse 9 is just one of the verses, and it says, do not cast me off in the time of old age. Do not forsake me when my strength fails. We also have passages like Isaiah 46 and verse 4, where we're told that even to your old age, God says, I am He, and even to gray hairs I will carry you. I have made and I will bear. Even I will carry and will deliver you. David, when he was older, in Psalm 37 says, starting at the 25th verse, I have been young and now am old. Yet I have not seen the righteous forsaken, nor his descendants begging bread. He is ever merciful and lends, and his descendants are blessed. Depart from evil and do good and dwell forevermore, for the Lord loves justice and does not forsake his saints. They are preserved forever, but the descendants of the wicked shall be cut off. There are a lot of giants that the older people face. But when you think about what it is that the men said to David, instead of looking at that as being something that would have just torn David down, and it may have in the moment, instead of looking at that as being a hard conversation for the men to have, which in the moment I'm sure it was, this was really a great compliment that the people were paying to David. Of all the compliments that were given to David, this is perhaps the greatest of all of them. There's nothing that we want you to do that will risk you quenching the lamp of Israel. They wanted that lamp to be preserved, that they could do without David being the soldier, but they could not do without David being the leader. And we need to see that as we grow older, that our responsibilities and the way in which we do things are going to have to be different. I was looking this up this last week. The largest growing age group in the United States is 85 and over. I was amazed by that. The largest growing age group in our country is 85 and over. That means there's more people turning 85 or older than there are babies being born. Teenagers, preteens moving into teenage years, those moving into young adult years. The reason being is because of the baby boom era and also the fact that people are having smaller and smaller families. The birth rate is way down. 85 and older. People are living longer. And among us as Christians, we know that this is going to be something that we're going to see as well, that there's going to be a lot more people moving into that age group. Therefore, we need to know how it is, how do we preserve these lamps? First, do we see that as being lamps? And how do we keep that light and the benefit from that? Leviticus 19:32 says, "You shall rise before the gray-headed and honor the presence of an old man and fear your God. I am the Lord." It's interesting that in the same verse that God says you fear him because he's the Lord, he puts this statement, the honor and respect that is due for those who are aged. And so one of the encouragements I want to give to the older people is live in such a way and grow to old age in such a way that it honors and glorifies the ageless one. And I think that's one of the things that we should walk away from this, is there's honor and respect that should come from those later years. Proverbs 16:31 says, "The silver-haired head is a crown of glory, if it is found in the way of righteousness." There's a lot of verses in the Old Testament, especially in the Proverbs, that talk about the way in which we're supposed to treat those who are older. But there's a lot of verses also that talk about the way in which you've grown older, especially if they're found in the way of righteousness. Because we know that just because a person grows older does not mean they've grown wiser. It does not mean that they are a good lamp. It doesn't mean they're a good example. But especially those who have grown up in this way and grown older in this way are deserving of our honor and our respect. Titus 2, verses 2 through 5, even in the New Testament, the older men are to have certain characteristics: sober, reverent, temperate, sound in faith, love, patience. The older women are also told that they're supposed to be of a certain character, that they are to be reverent in behavior, not slanderers, not given to much wine, teachers of good things. What unfortunately happens is the very time that you should be able to set such a very good example, some people retire from their service to God the same time they retire from their work. And sometimes this happens with men. They no longer exude these characteristics among the brethren. There was one lady that was asked after her husband retired, "Well, how are you enjoying your husband's retirement?" She says, "Well, it's twice the husband for half the pay." And I've seen families that are that way, that I've seen wives that are very disappointed with the fact that their husband's going to now be home every day. Because all of a sudden they've got all these things that should have been taken care of while they were spending 30 and 40 years at work, and the wife's been running the home just fine without them. What do you do with the time? I mean, especially in our country, we exert pressure toward that goal, and that's one of our aims in life. What are you going to do with that time? Have you thought about that? How's it going to be spent? The very time that women ought to be teaching, many of them stop teaching. And they say, well, we're going to leave this for the younger women. And yes, younger women are to step up. We're going to notice that in just a moment. But here the older women are the ones that are told to be teaching, the younger women. So we need to keep these things in mind, that just because we have grown older does not mean that we have grown useless. That we need to be using the talents and the abilities that we have for good. You think about some of the great warriors of the past and heroes of faith. You think about Moses and Aaron. They were 80 and 83 when they led the Israelites out of Egypt. You think about Joshua, who in the last 30 years of his life was leading the conquest of Canaan. He died at 110, which means from 80 to 110, he was leading that conquest. One of the ones that I love to read about is Caleb, who in Joshua 14 talked about the fact that this mountain had been promised to him long ago, and he had been waiting this 40 years where everyone else was dying in the wilderness to take this mountain. And he says, I'm as strong today to take this mountain as I was back then. I'm ready for that battle. Caleb was the kind of hero of the faith that would be encouraging. You have even among us people who imitate biblical heroes like Dorcas, who was making the garments for the poor and the widows of the brethren. Paul himself referred to himself as being the aged, and we see what Paul was able to accomplish. Now, our role in the church may change, and it would be good if it did, that some of the younger men need to be thinking about changing into that role of being an elder. Younger women, preparing yourself now by teaching classes so that you can in the future know how to teach not just classes, but younger women who will be taking your place in the future. We need to be aware that we are still valuable. Psalm 92, verses 12 through 15. The righteous shall flourish like a palm tree. He shall grow like a cedar in Lebanon. Those who are planted in the house of the Lord shall flourish in the courts of our God. They shall still bear fruit in old age. They shall be fresh and flourishing to declare, this is the purpose, to declare that the Lord is upright, to be able to say, He is my rock, and there is no unrighteousness in Him. There are cultures that gather around their older people to sit and to listen to those who are older, to the stories and the wisdom that they had. There are others, however, that the older are invisible to them, and maybe the older even to themselves. And it should not be so. The Bible wants us to give honor and reverence to those who have grown older, especially those in the Lord. When you think about even David himself, David did not receive this news and go back to his home and mope and pout, lock himself in his room, and to become a recluse where everybody is just now going to be waiting on him. When David went back, this is the stage of his life when he started making preparations for Solomon, his son, to build the temple that David was not going to be able to build. He started making plans. He started buying land. He started assigning personnel. This is a stage of his life where he was still appointing different individuals for work in the worship of God as song leaders and those who would use musical instruments and things such as that. This is the stage of life where David wrote some of his most beautiful psalms as well. Many times older people, when they're looking for encouragement and wanting something that will stir them and motivate them, are not going back to 1 Samuel 17 and David's battle with Goliath, but they are going to the Psalms because there's so much comfort and peace and reassurance and the reminder that God is your rock and your refuge. That's not something we should ignore. But it teaches us that preserving the lamps are so important. How many of our older people through the years, even if they're not amongst us anymore now, have been lamps to us, who showed us the way, who taught us the path, who showed us a good life to imitate. 1 Timothy 5 and verse 5 says that, now she who is really a widow, remember this is someone that's over 65 in this passage. Now she who is really a widow and left alone, she is by herself. She could feel abandoned. She is alone. She trusts in God and continues in supplications and prayers night and day. What can an older woman who is left alone do? Continue in supplications and prayers night and day, because they are of great benefit. 2 Corinthians 4 and verse 16, one of the keys to growing old is actually living new. 2 Corinthians 4:16 says, therefore we do not lose heart, even though our outward man is perishing, the inward man is being renewed day by day. That even as you grow older, don't lose heart. The inward is being renewed every day. You're still valuable. You're still the lamp, and you're still very much needed. But notice also, let's go back to 2 Samuel 21 and notice 2 Samuel 21. Let's notice the next several verses. Not only do you have this nephew, Abishai of David, who rescues him from this giant who had this new sword who thought he could kill David, but also in the next several verses. 2 Samuel 21, starting at verse 18. It happened afterward that there was again a battle with the Philistines at Gob. And then Sibbechai, the Hushathite, killed Saph, who was one of the sons of the giants. Verse 19, again there was war at Gob with the Philistines, where Elthanan, the son of Jerorigim, the Bethlehemite, killed the brother of Goliath, the Gittite. Could have been a different Goliath. Some say that it was the same Goliath. The shaft of whose spear was like a weaver's beam. Yet again, verse 20, there was again a war. And then we know that this giant, this man of great stature, who had 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot, 24 in number, and he was also born to the giant. So you see that all these other people in Israel, these other men are now fighting. Back in 1 Samuel 17, no one else was willing to go out to battle. But now, because of the leadership of David and the battles that he had fought and the way in which he had brought about victory, these others are now stepping forward to enter into the fight. I think that's a great testimony to the kind of leadership that David had. That these men are even facing the kind of giants that David never faced. David never faced some freakish giant who had 24 fingers and toes. And yet his men did. That's what good leadership does. That's what being a lamp does. That's what preserving that light is all about. That next generation is going to step up. We sometimes look at our young people and we think that they're never going to get it. They're never going to mature. They're never going to have wisdom. They're never going to have understanding. And we judge them by who they are right now instead of who they're going to be in the future. That if we keep being lamps and keep shining the light and keep teaching and guiding, the next generation is going to step up. I have no doubt of that. I'm not a pessimist when it comes to that. I believe that the Lord's church is going to persevere because God is with us and we are with God. Amen. That is what it's supposed to be. And the next generation are going to be good imitators. Paul says, we desire that each one of you show the same diligence to full assurance of hope until the end. Don't become sluggish, but imitate those who through faith and patience inherit the promises. Young people, look at these older people and know that you're going to be just like them. You're going to look in the mirror and be a reflection of who they are today. And if you don't want to be a grump, don't be a grump now. If you don't want to be a pessimist in the future, don't be a pessimist now. Be an imitator of those who inherit the promises. You're going to reap whatever it is that you sow. We know in Job 4 and verse 8 that even as I have seen those who plow iniquity and sow trouble reap the same. You can keep yourself from a lot of trouble in life if you'll right now decide, I'm not going to go down that path. These others did not. And even if they did, they've repented and changed. But know that you can save yourself a lot of trouble by the path that you choose now. Hosea 10 verse 12, this is from the New American Standard. Sow for yourselves with a view to righteousness. Harvest in accordance with kindness. Break up your uncultivated ground, for it is time to seek the Lord until he comes and rains righteousness on you. Understand that you can save yourself a lot of hardship, a lot of trouble, a lot of the bitterness and discontent and anger that we sometimes say criticize older people can be avoided by sowing with the view to righteousness instead of sowing to the flesh. The next generation can step up by making sure that just because you're growing older, it doesn't always mean you're maturing. But allow maturity to also go along with the years that you're accumulating as well. Hebrews 5 is a staunch reminder when we are told, by this time you ought to be teachers. You need someone to teach you again the first principles of the oracles of God. It makes it clear that milk is for babes, but meat is for the mature. That it is about the use of the things that you have learned, exercising yourself to discern the difference between good and evil. That's what true maturity is about, and not just in the form of years. When you think about wisdom, there's a few different ways to gain it. One way that you can gain wisdom is by trying to experience trial and error. And there's a lot of wisdom that can be gained from that. But there's also the reality that you may be wasting a lot of your life, wasting a lot of time doing it that way. God's word provides wisdom, provides instruction We know that from the Psalms. We know that from the Proverbs. We know it from Ecclesiastes. That doing it the way that God has said will give you wisdom without the heartache of the mistakes and the failures that others have gone through. How are you going to gain it? That's the question. So the question I'm going to leave you this morning is, are you ready to face your next giant? I don't know there's so many people in this audience. There's a giant that you're going to face next that's going to be different from the giant that someone else faces. For some of us in this audience, it may be that the next giant we face is impending death, knowing that age has caught up with us and we are no longer the men and women we used to be, that we need to learn how to do things differently, and we need to heed the counsel of others if that's the case. It may be like we're one of David's mighty men and we're ready to face that giant, but there's going to be another one on the horizon. Let it prepare you for that next battle. If you're not a Christian this morning, we want to help you. If there's anything that we can do to help you at whatever stage you are, whatever giant you're facing, if there's something we can do to help, that's what we're here to do. We want to be here for each other to make sure that we're in this fight together and we see it through to the end. If we can help in any way, please come as we stand and sing.